Hello, and welcome to American Catholic History, brought to you by the support of listeners like you. If you like our podcast, please become a supporter. Also, please be sure to rate us and give us a review wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crowe.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Today, we're talking about Annie Moore, the Catholic Irish teen who was the first immigrant to be processed at Ellis Island.
Now, I need to say at the outset that the factoid that this topic is based on came to me in a fantastic song, Isle of Hope, Isle of Tears, written by Irish songwriter Brendan Graham. My favorite performance is by the Irish tenors. The first lines of the song are, "On the first day of January 1892, they opened Ellis Island and they let the people through. The first to cross the threshold of the Isle of Hope and Tears was Annie Moore from Ireland, who was all of 15 years. Now, there is some question about her actual age. Family lore says she was actually 17 when she came over, but that she lied about her age to get a cheaper fare on the ship. But regardless, the lyrics of the song are about as heart-wrenching and heartwarming as you might expect. Deep longing for Ireland, despite the pain that was experienced there, trepidation and hope about the future in this new land. It's a lovely song. We'll link to the album in our show notes. But yes, that opening just screams for a story to be told, so here we are.
Yeah. Well, let's be honest. You don't need much to find a story to tell.
Hey, it's life.
And to tell it in the most embellished way possible.
Because life is just one amazing story after another, just waiting to be told, if you know how to look at it all. But in this case, my goodness, Ellis Island, a 15 or 17-year-old girl who is apparently, not really, but apparently on her own. It's just screaming drama.
Well, that's definitely true in this case. But as we'll relate, recent scholarship has shed a bit of light on the life of Annie Moore after she got here. But, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. To really start out, let's talk a little about Ellis Island and where it is and what it is and why it became the major point of entry for immigrants.
Sure. So most of our listeners likely know a thing or two about Ellis Island, but a refresher for them and an intro for those who don't wouldn't be a bad thing. Ellis Island was the main point of entry for immigrants to the United States from 1892 into the 1920s, and it was in use for processing immigrants until it closed in 1954.
For the first 100 or so years of the United States, there really weren't any laws regulating or coordinating immigration into the country. There were laws about becoming a citizen, but the borders were generally unenforced. If you could make it here, good for you. You could work, pay taxes, serve in the military, and enjoy the liberties that our Constitution and laws afforded. You could not, however, vote or hold office without becoming a citizen.
This open borders policy toward immigration began to change in the latter half of the 19th century, however. The effort to regulate immigration began for a few reasons. One, frankly, eugenics. The idea had taken hold that some races were superior to others, and the population had to protect itself from being tainted by inferior genes.
Yeah, and among those who didn't go in for eugenics, there was a legitimate concern about communicable diseases coming into crowded cities. New epidemics could spread quickly in a place with no natural immunity or adequate medical care, and cities were very susceptible.
Yes. Another one was political unrest. With the emergence of anti-liberty philosophies and ideologies in Europe, such as socialism and communism, the U.S. government was concerned not to allow into the country people who would foment political unrest here.
Right. And officials didn't want to let in people who would just become a burden on society, like the sick or those unable or unwilling to take care of themselves and who had no one to support them here in the U.S. already.
Yeah, and it's interesting how many of those are still talked about as legitimate reasons to have secure borders and a healthy, justice-based legal immigration regime. Anyhow, so these concerns drove the various states to begin to regulate immigration.
Right, because this was all done at the state level initially. There was no federal agency set up to regulate immigration at the time.
No, and that caused problems. Some states like New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland had many more immigrants arriving in their ports than others, which gave those states a lot of power and responsibility when it came to immigration.
Consider that New York City, Philadelphia, and Baltimore were primary ports of arrival for transatlantic ocean liners from Europe. When the non-Americans disembarked, they were subject to whatever the state officials had set up to manage immigration.
And that also meant they were subject to whatever corruption was running things, like in New York City.
Right. Local gangs, often with ties back to the home country, could take in the newcomers and give them a hand. And before they knew it, the newcomers were hopelessly indebted to the gang for their home, livelihood, protection, etc. The situation was ripe for abuse.
But the various governments didn't handle things in an even-handed manner either. Government is nothing if not inconsistent and sometimes opaque. Those immigrants who came across the ocean as first and second class passengers generally received very little scrutiny. They were a nicer sort of people, of course. As they crossed the ocean, usually some immigration officials on board the ship would visit with each of these wealthier immigrants and just check to be sure their papers were in order. They rarely faced questions raised about health or anyone's ability to support themselves or whether or not they intended to overthrow the government. So when they arrived in port, they just walked off the ship and into the city.
Third class and steerage passengers were another story. These were the people who were more likely fleeing destitution, war, trouble at home, or other calamities. They generally could only barely afford their ticket on board. They spent the 2-week voyage below deck, generally in very uncomfortable and unsanitary conditions. When they arrived in port, they were brought ashore in barges and processed through a series of health tests and interviews to determine their suitability for entry.
Like we said, the government officials wanted to make sure that they wouldn't spread disease, be a burden, or cause a problem. So New York City set up their first immigration processing center at Castle Garden at the Battery, which is at the very southern tip of Manhattan Island. This served as the New York point of entry from 1855 through 1890. About 8 million immigrants passed through that office.
And it was, more often than not, a model of incompetence and corruption.
Yep.
And then things got worse. Famine, war, and worsening economic conditions in places like Ireland, the Germanic countries, and Scandinavia brought a surge of immigrants to the United States in the latter half of the 19th century. Castle Garden simply could not handle the waves of humanity crashing on their shores.
To deal with the surge and to bring a measure of professionalism, uniformity, efficiency, and competency to immigration, the federal government stepped in. Yes.
But in this case, they really did improve matters dramatically.
You're right. They did.
Not always bad.
Yes, true.
Often.
Right. Yes, especially when compared to the absolute mess that was Castle Garden. The first thing the federal government did was to settle on Ellis Island in New York Harbor as the site for the new immigration processing station.
And they chose Ellis Island because they knew that New York was the #1 point of entry, and so it had to be somewhere there.
They also knew it had to be on an island, so the people they brought to it would be contained and couldn't just, leak into the city.
And they needed it to be something they already controlled, so they wouldn't have to deal with acquiring something in New York or New Jersey.
Ellis Island was in New York Harbor. It was an island, as the name suggests, and they already used it for a number of purposes, most of them military.
Right, so it was a natural fit.
Natural. They built a very large building out of Georgia pine that would be able to handle many thousands of immigrants, way more than Castle Garden, every day. This brand new facility opened to much fanfare on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1892.
And this is where Annie Moore comes into the story.
Yes, finally, she walks across our threshold. As the song says, she was the first to cross the threshold. She was a Catholic Irish lass born and raised in County Cork, which is down on the southwest corner of the Emerald Isle. Her parents had already come over to the U.S. 4 years prior. Annie and 2 of her brothers stayed back in Ireland until enough money was raised to bring them over. So finally, on December 20th, 1891, Annie, with her younger brothers Philip and Anthony, boarded the steamer Nevada as a steerage passengers for the 12-day crossing.
The Nevada arrived in New York Harbor on the night of December 31st. As per usual, the steerage passengers weren't permitted to disembark immediately. They had to wait until the following morning. When they did, since they would be the first to go through the new Ellis Island Processing Center, they boarded barges fitted with festive red, white, and blue bunting, and they were taken, amid bells clanging and much fanfare, to Ellis Island.
Annie and her brothers were near the head of the line as the barge arrived. The passengers knew there was something special waiting for the first person to be processed, and while most of the passengers were happy to let the wee Irish lass have the honor, there was a large German man who was not so willing to step aside. But when the gangplank was lowered and the passengers released, Annie's brothers managed to jostle her into the lead. To seal the deal for Annie, an Irish longshoreman helping on shore quickly ascertained the situation, and with a loud, "Ladies first!" he held up the German just enough. Annie was in.
After she and her brothers were officially registered, Annie was presented with a $10 gold coin to commemorate the occasion. It was the first American money she had ever seen and the largest single sum of money she would possess in her lifetime. She reportedly said she would never part with it, but would always keep it as a pleasant memento of the occasion. Also present at the ceremony was a Catholic priest who blessed her and also gave her some silver coins.
Yeah, it's fitting that a Catholic chaplain was present, given how many of the immigrants who passed through Ellis Island were Catholic.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that was very strategic on their part. Right. And then after that, just to round it out, another gentleman slipped her $5 before she and her brothers escaped into her parents' warm embrace. Now, we're not sure how much the silver coins may have been worth, but that $15 works out to more than $530 today. Not a bad haul for a person who arrived with basically nothing.
Yeah, seriously. During its 62 years of use, more than 12 million immigrants came through Ellis Island. The biggest waves came from southern, central, and eastern Europe, so Italians, Greeks, Slovaks, Ukrainians, Poles, Croats, Czechs, all those Slavs. The Italians and Poles were predominantly Latin Rite Catholics, like the Irish, but the non-Polish Slavs were mostly Eastern Rite Catholics, also with plenty of Eastern Orthodox included.
And naturally, that means the church had a rapidly growing flock, especially in the cities. And the church, well, however, it was kind of slow to ramp up its aid to immigrants.
Granted, the church was still very much a minority in the cities and mostly poor. Also, the era of significant anti-Catholic activity wasn't that far in the past. In some places, it hadn't actually ended, and this surge kind of brought it back. The resources and organization to do a whole lot quickly just weren't there for the church.
No, it was a huge challenge. But that doesn't mean Catholics did nothing. Many groups of immigrants had their own ethnic societies, and these had been aiding immigrants from their respective homelands for years. The hierarchy of the church in America wasn't organized for nationwide work until 1919, when bishops established the National Catholic Welfare Council.
In 1920, the NCWC, which was the precursor to today's U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, established the Bureau of Immigration. This bureau maintained relations with the Catholic hierarchy in the countries from which the immigrants were coming. The bureau also maintained staff on Ellis Island. They were able to aid immigrants as they arrived, to connect them to needed assistance, and send word to the Catholic institutions at their intended destinations within the U.S. that they were coming.
Yeah, just a little aside on that, there is an AI platform that currently works to connect immigrants to their ethnic societies and communities here in the United States, and it's actually named after Annie Moore.
Cool.
Yeah. More local to Ellis Island, Archbishop Patrick Hayes of New York tasked the Diocesan Council of Catholic Women with helping the massive number of immigrants who stayed in and near New York City. In its first year alone, the council helped more than 6,000 immigrants. Part of their care included having people available who spoke every language, so immigrants who didn't speak English would be able to communicate.
Nowadays, you just open your phone to the Translate app and you can just,
A little easier, I suppose.
Yeah, a little bit. But back then, having those people had to have been a tremendous help, especially since so many of these people didn't want to leave their home country, but had been forced to flee conflict and oppression, famine, etc. They weren't exactly in a position to learn English before making the journey.
Right, like my Polish ancestors and your Ukrainian and Slovak ancestors.
Yes, in fact, my Ukrainian great-grandmother never learned English and never really left the farm here in Ohio once she and my great-grandfather settled on it.
Right. Well, language, of course, wasn't the problem for Annie Moore. She probably knew Gaelic, but she definitely would have spoken English.
And as for what became of Annie Moore, well, history kind of lost track of her for a while. After moving into her parents' home in Manhattan, she was thought to have married a man who took her to Texas, where she lived, raised a family, and died in 1924. However, more recent scholarship by genealogist Megan Smoleniak established that Annie Moore was actually born in Illinois, not County Cork, Ireland. In fact, according to Smoleniak squared, the actual Annie Moore of this story stayed in Manhattan.
Yeah, she married a Catholic German named Joseph Augustus Scheer, known as Gus, who would work at the Fulton Fish Market. Annie and Joseph, or Gus as he was known, lived in a flat on Manhattan's Lower East Side, more than one actually. And Annie rarely left the few blocks around their home for the rest of her life. They had 11 children, but only 6 lived to adulthood.
Annie herself died in 1924 of heart failure at just 47 years old, or 50 by her family's reckoning, and she was buried near her predeceased children in Queens. Initially, her grave was unmarked, but in 2006 it was located, and in October 2008, a Celtic cross made of Irish blue limestone was erected to honor her.
But her surviving children and the children of her 2 brothers did the American thing. They spread out across the country, married people of many other ethnic backgrounds, and a number of them moved up the social ladder, leaving behind the poverty that Annie and her generation endured.
Based on census data, it is estimated that 40% of the current U.S. population descends from people who came through Ellis Island. I am certainly among that 40%, and I believe both sides of my family came through Ellis Island, with my dad's Irish ancestors coming through in the 1890s and my mom's side coming in the 19-teens from the Galicia region, which is today split up among Ukraine, Poland, and Slovakia.
Well, I'm also part of that 40% through my mother. My dad's ancestry predates Ellis Island, and the French-Canadian heritage from my mom's dad's side came naturally from Canada, but my mom's Polish mother, whose last name was Gruzewski, was born of immigrants that came through Ellis Island, settled in McKees Rocks, Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I wonder if you're related to Annie Moore. I mean, all Irish are related, aren't they?
Of course we are. But, it's actually entirely possible. I'm not aware of any more among the maiden names from my family tree. There's a Carney, McGarry, Michael. There's even a Dutch woman whose last name was Host. But I'm not aware of any more. But if there's a relation, she'd be earlier than all of the names that I've heard. So it is possible. Next time we're in New York City, maybe we take the ferry over to Ellis Island and see what we can find out.
Well, that would be interesting. Though, of course, you'd be looking for a German last name eventually, right?
Sure.
And it kind of helps make the point, though, that Annie Moore's story and her extended family are something of a microcosm of the American story and the American Catholic story. Come to America, enjoy liberty, live life, make stories to share, and pass it all on to the next generation. Ellis Island's role as the primary way for immigrants to enter the country waned after World War I, when the U.S. opened new embassies in many countries where there had been none before. Embassies allowed many who wished to emigrate to America to do most of the processing back at home before boarding a ship: paperwork, interviews, and health checkups. After 1924, the only people sent to be processed at Ellis Island were those whose paperwork was somehow not in order or who still had other big question marks upon arrival.
It's actually where we get the term, which is used as a pejorative nowadays, but WOP, W-O-P, without paperwork or without passport.
Ah.
Yeah. So the immigrant processing facility at Ellis Island closed in 1954. 12 million people had passed through the Isle of Hope and Tears during its 62 years of use.
In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson added Ellis Island to the Statue of Liberty National Monument. Since that time, the island and its facilities have been open to the public and enhanced bit by bit to make it what it is today, the Ellis Island National Museum of Immigration, a museum which receives 2 million visitors annually.
And ready to welcome those 2 million visitors is a bronze statue of the first girl welcomed to America on Ellis Island. 15 or 17-year-old Annie Moore, with a look of hope and happiness on her face, carrying her case and holding onto her hat in the breeze.
This statue is the sister statue to one on the docks in Cobh, Ireland, the port from which Annie and her brothers left Ireland. The statue in Ireland depicts Annie and her two brothers looking out to sea toward their new life in the New World. The two statues at the two ends of the Moor's voyage in America demonstrate the lasting connection to the homeland. Each immigrant may leave their home, but they never forget where they come from, and they always bring some of it with them. This has been American Catholic History. If you enjoy American Catholic History, please become a supporter. Get information on how to become a supporter at americancatholichistory.org/support.
Also on our website, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about Ellis Island and Annie Moore, see about our pilgrimages, and find other great stories from American Catholic history.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. Those and... I don't know why it came out like that.
Except for the one where it's like, great content, but you guys are too silly. 1 star. We didn't appreciate that one, but we laughed at it. We're not too silly. We're exactly enough silly.
Oh my goodness.
Anyhow.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. These and the 5-star ratings help others find us. You can email us feedback, questions, tips for episode topics, and other comments at feedback@americancatholichistory.org. We really love it when more people can find us.
Absolutely.
And you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/American Catholic History, on Instagram at ACH_podcast, and follow us on X at ACH1513. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Thanks for listening to American Catholic History, brought to you by the support of listeners like you.